I have a case for you today that is from way over the pond in Germany. I wanted to do a story from someplace different this week, but I also wanted to do one that hasn't been overdone here. And I actually picked a German case because there aren't a lot of podcasts that do German cases. There's lots from the UK and Australia, but not Germany so much. This is the murder of Ursula Herrmann. Ursula Herrmann was a very bubbly little girl from Bavaria, Germany. She was born in 1971, just like myself. She played piano, she did gymnastics. She was the youngest of four siblings. She was quite adored by her community because of her short blonde locks of hair, her positive spirit, and her high energy. Her father was a teacher, and her mom was a stay at home mom. And in those days, that was still referred to as being a housewife. It is very interesting that I could not find one article or sort of coverage on this case that names Ursula's parents or any of her other siblings other than her older brother Michael, who was 18 at the time. Michael has a very important part of this story, which I'll get to later. And no, he did not do it. Ursula and her family lived on the lake side of Lake Ammersee, which sits between the town of Schondorf and Ecking. I think that's how you pronounce it, Ecking. Well, it's probably not how you pronounce it, but it's how it's written in English. And what separates the two towns is this very lush and dense forest. Although the area that they lived, which was close to Ecking, was a wealthy area, the Hermans had only actually been able to afford to build there because her great grand like the mother's great grandmother had purchased pasture area for his animals a number of decades before. So they were not a wealthy family, but they weren't poor either. They were just sort of average middle class, just a very respected family. And on the afternoon of September 15th of 1981, which was the first day of school, 10-year-old Ursula came home from school that day. She practiced her piano and then headed off to Schondorf for her gymnastics class. And to get there, she rode her bike through this forested area. There was paths there along the lakeside. Now, after her gymnastics class, she went over to her cousin's house, which was also in Schondorf, and she had dinner with her family there. So at 7:20, her mom called her aunt and told her it was time for Ursula to come home because it was going to be dark soon. And that ride home on her bike should have taken her about 10 minutes. She was wearing dark corduroy pants, dark green corduroy pants. There was a gray cardigan and then reddish brown sandals. And a half an hour later, she still had not gotten home. So her mom called her sister's house again and she said that Ursula had left like 25 minutes ago. So they both kind of knew something was wrong. Now, Ursula's father went into the forest from the Ecking side, and then her uncle went in from the Schondorf side. And then when they met in the middle, they hadn't found her. So they called in some neighbors, the police, local firemen to help with the search. They scoured the lake, the brush, the undergrowth. They brought in search dogs, which led them away from the lake into sort of the middle of the brush in this forested area. So it was about 20 meters from the pathway, and they found her bike that had been discarded. It was a red bike, but she was nowhere to be found. So by this time it's dark and it's raining. So first thing in the morning, they start to search again. Now, this time they're using a helicopter, police boats, and divers as well. Now, Ursula went missing on a Tuesday night. So on the Thursday, so this is about 36 hours later, the Herman's phone rang. There was at first there was silence, and then there was this like eerie jingle which played, which they recognized. It was from traffic bulletins on the Bayern 3 radio station that had been done, and then there was more silence, and then the caller just hung up. Now, three more calls, exactly the same, came in over the next couple of hours, and the police stationed themselves actually in the home and recorded those calls. So the next day, her mom went to get the mail, and there was a letter addressed to Ursula's dad, marked urgent. And it was literally one of those stereotypical ransom notes, complete with like cutout letters from magazines. And it said in broken German, "We kidnapped your daughter. If you ever want to see your daughter alive again, then pay 2 million Deutschmark, which is about 450,000 pounds ransom." And it said that they would phone and use this jingle and just say if you will pay or not pay. And if you call the police or you do not pay, we will kill your daughter. Now, the kidnapper or kidnappers weren't the greatest at sort of thinking things through all the way because they kind of forgot that mail takes a day or two, and they, of course, had already started calling. So when the phone rang that afternoon and the jingle sounded, Ursula's mum agreed to pay the ransom. She also asked for proof of life, like what were her daughter's nicknames for her two stuffed toys she had. And when the kidnappers did not reply, she became like frantic and she said, "Talk to me, tell me something, something from Ursula." No, that would have been on the Saturday, I believe. So on the Monday, the 21st of September, another letter arrived. Now, this one had instructions that were very specific, but not the important parts. The kidnappers wanted the money to be paid in used 100 Deutschmark bills packed in a suitcase, and it was to be delivered by Ursula's father, who was to drive in a yellow Fiat 600 going no faster than 90 kilometers an hour, but they kind of forgot where he was supposed to drive to. So a neighbor actually raised part of the ransom, and the state agreed that they would cover the rest of it. So they had the money ready. They were willing to pay, get their daughter back, but then there was nothing. Like there was no more phone calls, no more letters, nothing. So after 2 weeks had passed with nothing, the police decided they got to search the forest again. So more than 100 officers were assembled with sniffer dogs. The wood was divided up into four parts, so each quarter into these small grids. And the teams were searching like their grid one by one using metal rods to probe the ground, so they didn't miss anything. And by the fourth day of searching, Ursula had been missing now for 19 days. At 9:30 a.m., there was a loud shout from like a tiny little sort of field area. It was about 800 meters away from that lake path. One of the officers had struck something solid when they were probing the soil there. And another police officer rushed over, and after wiping away the leaves and scraping through a layer of like clay, they discovered a brown blanket covering a wooden board. And so he removed it to find a second board, which appeared to be like the lid of a box. It was 72 centimeters by 60 centimeters, so the size of a small coffee table. It was painted green and then locked from the top with 7 sliding bolts. So using a spade, they were able to force the lid open and peered in, and there was Ursula. And of course, her body was cold and lifeless. So the officer was actually weeping when he pulled her out of the ground. So Ursula's dad, when he was told that they had found her, he just kept asking if she was hurt in any way before she was killed. So an autopsy concluded that Ursula died within about 30 minutes to 5 hours of being buried there, since there was no signs of a struggle or really even any movement at all from her inside the box. The doctors kind of figured that she might have been drugged beforehand, possibly with nitrous oxide. It appeared that the kidnappers had planned to keep Ursula alive. The box, which was 1.4 meters deep, was fitted with a shelf. It had a seat in there that doubled as a toilet area. It was stocked with about 3 bottles of water. There was 12 cans of Fanta, 6 large chocolate bars, 4 packs of biscuits, which cookies, and 2 packs of chewing gum. And it also had this kind of strange library of about 21 books. There was things from Donald Duck up to like westerns, romance novels, thrillers. There were titles like The Horror Lurks Everywhere. There was a light in there with a portable radio, which was tuned to that Bayern 3, which is the same station that broadcast that traffic jingle. Uh, and then to enable Ursula to breathe, The box had this ventilation system that was made from plastic plumbing pipes, which extended to the ground level. But whoever had designed it had failed to realize that without like a machine to circulate the air, the oxygen would actually quickly run out. So the police believed that they were hunting for more than one kidnapper because of the size and weight of this box, which was about 60 kilograms. It would have needed at least two people to try to carry it into the woods. And the perpetrators must have known that forest pretty well because they had chosen a very remote spot for it within there and had avoided attention, of course, while digging this hole and like hacking through all this underbrush. The media hounded the Hermans, and at the funeral, Ursula's brother Michael um, had a photographer that shoved a camera right in his face, and so he actually knocked him and the camera to the ground. The family was just distraught. And Ursula's mom actually never recovered from the loss of her daughter. The police offered a 30,000 um, Deutschmark reward for information, and tips did pour in. One name that came up was a guy named Werner Mazurek. Now, he was 31. He lived with his wife and their two children. It was just about 100 meters from where the Hermans lived. He was a trained car mechanic who left school at 15 and was running his own TV repair business. And Berserk he was good with his hands. He was very imposing. He was tall. He had kind of a beer drinker's stomach and he was very quick tempered. He was not very well liked in Ecking. He was also heavily in debt. He owed the bank more than 140 Deutschmarks. So he did have a motive. But he was questioned by the police about a week after Ursula's body had been found, and he couldn't initially recall his movements on that night that she went missing. It took him about 24 hours to come up with an alibi. He said he had been playing the board game Risk with his wife and two of their friends, but a search of his home and his workshop revealed nothing that linked him to the crime. Now, later that month, the forensic team examined the box that was. They found a fingerprint that was on a piece of duct tape there, raising hopes that there was going to be this breakthrough. Um, Now, thousands of people, including this Mazurek, were fingerprinted, but there was no match discovered. So the police suspected that Mazurek was at least involved. So at the end of January of 1982, they arrested him along with two of his friends and interrogated them for several days before releasing them. Now, a month later, after Mazurek's acquaintances were questioned, Klaus Foffinger was he was an unemployed mechanic with a drinking problem. Now, his landlord, who to whom he owed some rent, had told police that in the weeks before the crime, he had seen this guy driving his moped with a spade strapped to the side of it. Now, this Foffinger initially said, "No, I'm innocent," but on the second day of questioning, the interrogators sort of took a break, and so he was alone with the police secretary at that time, and he said, "What if I know something?" And when the interrogators returned, he told them that Mazurek had asked him to dig a hole in the forest in early September of 1981, promising payment of 1,000 Deutschmarks and a color TV. Now, Foffinger said that he had dug the hole and had later seen a box embedded inside of it. Now, convinced that they had cracked the case, the detective drove Foffinger to the forest that separated this Ecking and Schondorf, and they asked him to lead them to the burial site. But to their dismay, he was unable to do that, and he couldn't even come close to it. So, on returning to the police station, he said, "I'm revoking this confession. It's not true what I said." So, during 10 subsequent interrogations in the following months, he refused to repeat his confession. So he was eventually released without any charges. So by the summer of 1982, the lead detective who had pursued him was replaced by a new person. So the new police team found found some more evidence of the kidnappers' methods that they had used, including a wire that had been strung through the trees along the lakeside path to serve as this alert system during the abduction. And the investigators realized that it must have been used during her abduction. While one of the kidnappers waited for the victim, the other one would have served as like a lookout further along the path. And then their finger would be on a button that would light up a bulb or sound a buzzer on the other end of the wire to alert them. But the case still was cold. So, in and around 2005, the cold case was looked into again, and prosecutors hoped that the development of DNA profiling over the previous 2 decades might actually help crack the case. So, the massive evidence that they had from the original investigation, including the ransom notes, the box, were painstakingly re examined. There were numerous hairs found. And they were able to build the DNA profiles of several different people, but they just needed like a match, someone to match the physical description too. Now, from the prosecutors who were looking at the Herman case, I mean, from their side, time is really running out because her death had not actually been deemed a murder, but rather a kidnapping with sort of deadly consequences. It was a crime that carried a 30-year statute of limitations. So in 5 years, the people were responsible for this would be in the clear. The state prosecutors went back to the 1980s case files to look back at those main suspects again. Klaus Foffinger, that unemployed man who had briefly claimed to have dug the hole, he was dead. But Werner Mazurek was still alive at that time, and he was living with his wife in North Germany, somewhere in North Germany, where he ran a boat accessories business. And then with another friend on Tuesday evenings, he would run a snack bar with the advertising slogan, Nordberg's Pig and Werner's Beer, the finest at the harbor pier. In 2007, Mazurek was placed under surveillance, and an undercover officer deployed to kind of befriend him. Police planted recording devices in his car and in his home. They tapped his phone. And then in October of that year, his house was searched. He was asked to provide a saliva sample. It did not match any of the genetic profiles that were found on the box at the time. The only thing that they did have was an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. So in the calls that had been made to Ursula's parents in the days after her disappearance, the kidnappers had played this jingle. So was it possible that the device that they found at Werner's place was the same one that was used to record those radio jingles? So a sound expert who had access to the original recordings of the 1981 calls, he spent months conducting tests on the tape recorder, concluding that it was indeed the one that was used in the kidnapping. So on May 28th, 2008, Ursula's parents, who were still living in the same house uh, at the time, had been notified a few days before that this arrest was imminent. And they were also told that they could be part of this trial. So, under the German legal systems, relatives of the victims of certain serious crimes are allowed to formally join the prosecution as like co-plaintiffs. And it gives them the right to view the evidence, request witnesses, and put questions to the judges. So Ursula's parents did not want to be confronted again with any of the horrifying details of their daughter's death, uh, all, even all those years later. So instead, it was agreed to that the co-plaintiff would be their oldest son, Michael, who was at that time he was in his 40s. He was teaching religion and music at a girls' secondary school in Augsburg. So the trial opened in February of 2009. It was a packed courtroom. Mazurek was characterized in the newspapers as a bearded giant. So he sat in front of his wife, who was also on trial, actually, as an accessory to the crime. And reading from a 20-page statement, Mazurek insisted he was innocent. Quote, I know I was certainly not a good citizen, sometimes rude, and will see many attempts to portray me as a bad person, but I have nothing to do with this act, end quote. Now, the prosecution had no problem finding evidence of his poor character. Mazurek's daughter and stepson had very few good things to say about him as a father. He had had a number of scrapes with the law, including a fraud conviction in 2004 for falsifying documents. And then there was this story about the dog. So in 1974, Mazurek returned from the Oktoberfest beer festival to find the family dog. A mixed breed named Susie had overturned the garbage in the kitchen, and he grabbed the dog, locked it in the basement freezer. And the next day, his wife, at the time, it was a different wife, who soon divorced him, went to the freezer to get some meat, only to discover Susie in there frozen to death. Now, he later said that he had punished the pet with exile to Siberia. Now, the prosecution laid out this circumstantial evidence against him that he had a motive because he needed money, and then the means to secretly build this box because he owned this workshop. Now, while Ursula was missing, he had been observed listening to a police radio, and then a piece of leather used in the box construction was cut from a belt owned by somebody with a large stomach, like Mazurek had. And in 2007, after the police searched and bugged his home, they listened in on a phone call between him and an old friend from Ecking, where they discussed the statute of limitations for this Ursula Herrmann case. But the key elements of the prosecutor's case were the revoked confession that this Faffinger guy had done, that he had dug this hole at his request, and the tape recorder. Now, they insisted that the confession was credible, as the police files showed that his confession was actually accurate in a couple of different ways, right? He described this burial site in quite good detail, from the size of the forest sort of field where she was and the dimensions of the hole and the soil conditions there. Now, the lead police investigator in 1982 was convinced that he had deliberately misled them during the visit to the forest, where he couldn't locate the box. He testified in court that um, that Pfaffinger was an excellent actor and practiced swindler. The tape recorder, though, was the most important and the most controversial piece of evidence. Now, when questioned by police in 2007, Zurich said that he had purchased it only a few weeks earlier at the flea market while on a holiday with his wife, but he couldn't prove who sold it to him, and nobody at the market could recall them ever having a device like that on sale that day. The state's expert witness, who specifically was like, his specialty was actually more phonetics than audio. He described how in the recording of the ransom calls, you could hear a couple of like clicking sounds on the buttons of the tape recorder being pressed during the recording of the jingle. Now, when she pressed the buttons on the tape machine, she had, in her words, an aha moment. The sounds were identical. Now, other subtle characteristics of the recording also corresponded precisely to the specific machine that she had, which she said was probable that they were the same tape recorder found in his house that had been used in these ransom calls. So, summing it up, in March of 2010, the senior prosecutor reminded the court that Ursula had been buried alive in a box, revealing the cold bloodedness and mercilessness of the perpetrator. So, three judges and two jurors were convinced. They found Mazurek guilty, sentenced him to life imprisonment. Now, his wife was acquitted due to the lack of evidence. In court, everybody seemed pretty happy with this outcome, that Ursula's killer had finally been put away. Well, everyone except for one person. So, before this whole trial had started, to the surprise of his state assigned lawyer, Michael had requested full access to all the case files, which ran into the thousands of scanned pages. So in the first few weeks of the trial, he went through about 6,000 pages. He locked himself in the study at night. He just couldn't stop reading this stuff. Now he recalled that, despite the fact that Ursula had been very lively and very bubbly, she was also very cautious. So to Michael, there was a lot of things that did kind of point that this Mazurek guy could be the one, but he had some problems with it as well. Like, he couldn't understand why this Boffinger guy had revoked his confession, and and yet how his initial confession was then being treated as being plausible. The guy had a serious alcohol problem. Like while he was in detention, he had claimed to experience some hallucinations. He was chronically out of work. And he was just sort of a lazy guy who would have never agreed to dig a large hole for any amount of money. He was just super lazy. So as the court heard it, his original confession wasn't even signed. The investigator had just kind of wrote it down from memory like a number of weeks later. There was no DNA that was connecting this Foffinger to the crime or to the digging of it. And they also had exhumed his body after he had died. There was no DNA or match to these genetic profiles that they had discovered a few years later. So, but most concerning to Michael was this tape recorder. Now, he had a background in music, and so he knew a lot about acoustics and sound engineering, and he couldn't understand how this tape recorder could be definitively linked to ransom calls all those years ago. Like even if it was a reel to reel device had been used to record the jingle from the radio, um, the kidnappers would have still had to transfer that to a second recording, like a more portable device, since the calls had been made from payphones. Like if you're going to a payphone, you're not lugging this giant piece of equipment with you. And the acoustic environments in a phone booth and at the kidnapper's home would have influenced sort of how or what the police eventually heard and recorded on the line. So 6 months after the trial, this would have been late 2010, Michael started to notice this kind of high frequency noise that he was getting in his left ear, and it would wake him up at night and he couldn't get to sleep. And so actually he had a psychologist examine him, and he had developed tinnitus, which they felt was stress related from the court case, that had been the cause of it. So during this whole trial, Mazurek had sent Michael actually a letter, not to thank him for sort of questioning the whole tape recorder evidence, but to suggest that they were, on the same side of this. Like from prison, he kept writing. He would send him even a Christmas card. So in 2013, he finally replied, I was surprised to receive a letter from you because it is certainly clear that you, despite all your doubts I have about your guilt, I have considerable reservations about your person. If you are not the culprit, I wish for new insights and that you can be rehabilitated. If you are the culprit, go to hell. But then, so by then, Michael was pretty skeptical that Mazurek was actually guilty, because after the trial had ended, Michael kept kind of returning um, night after night with his ear ringing to these case files, which he had now stored in his computer, and he was sort of arranging them in folders. Of course, this whole thing had put a strain on his marriage. He separated from his wife in 2012, but he could not let this go. Like he felt he owed it to his parents, to himself, and to the even just the German public to get to the truth. What drives me is ethics, doing what is morally right. It was just wrong for the case to end like it did. So he came up with a plan. In 2013, he filed a civil claim seeking 20,000 euros in damages from Mazurek for causing his tinnitus. So this was actually kind of a legal ruse, since Mazurek, of course, would defend on the case basis that he had been wrongfully convicted, so he couldn't be considered responsible for the tinnitus. The court would then have to reconsider the facts of the criminal trial before coming to a conclusion about the civil case. So it would be an opportunity to get closer to the truth. So in August of 2018, the civil case concluded and the court ordered Mazurek to pay $7,000 for causing his tinnitus. So it was like a victory technically to Michael, but it was actually a loss to him, because by arriving at that decision, the judges had basically said that they agreed with the criminal court that he had been responsible for kidnapping Ursula. So, in an open letter to the Bavarian state and the media, Michael wrote, "My sister's fate has stayed with me for 37 years, and to this day it is unclear who is actually responsible for her death. Could it be that the Augsburg legal system is not actually interested in solving the case of Ursula Herrmann, the death of my little sister? If the court decides to close the proverbial lid, it should be well aware that one cannot shut the truth away." End quote. Now, he believes that the wire, this tripwire thing that was kind of was is one of the key pieces of evidence that could help identify the real kidnappers. The boarding school students, they all knew this forest pretty well, but they didn't fingerprint any of the kids at the school at the time of the investigation, including like the high school students as well. Another piece of evidence that also kind of hints that there could be some younger people involved is an impression on the paper of one of the ransom notes revealed this mathematical probability tree. It's the sort that's taught to teenagers. And he notes that there was also a comic book found in the box that Ursula was in. It was a rare one. Um, and one of the main characters in this drives a Fiat 600, which of course was the car that was mentioned in the ransom note. It was very rare in Germany at the time, suggesting that the whoever had kidnapped her had maybe read that comic book. So late in 2022, there was an effort to have the case reopened. Michael submitted um, basically a letter of all his new evidence and theories to the state's prosecutor's office in Augsburg, which was in April. There were still a lot of questions about the criminal trial. It was basically the public prosecutor said that no, they had reached the correct decision in 2010 and that it was final, absolute. And then in August, it was officially closed, and they were not going to reopen the case. Now, interestingly, there was a letter sent to one of the big media outlets there in November of 2020 claiming to have been responsible for the crime. Now, it was done by computer, but it was hand signed from someone that was a high school student at Ursula's school at the time in 1981. He said he committed the crime with friends, and the fact that the letter was received at all wasn't even released publicly until March of 2021. It has not been verified because the case, of course, is considered cold. Now, Werner's only hope for freedom is early parole, which I believe he was eligible to apply for in 2023, but I've not heard if he, in fact, was successful in that or if he even applied. And that was the kidnapping and murder of Ursula Herrmann. So please join me again next week for another case. And thank you so much for watching.